All right. So this is week 2 of cognitive science. I'm going to record a couple of videos and upload them, and then we'll talk about them on Wednesday. This is also going to be the last time you see my face because I don't know what part of the PowerPoint it's going to block. So just imagine I'm reading it the entire time. It's going to be great. Okay. All right. So we're going to be talking about the unconscious mind today, and that's going to be a lot more history. We're going to spend some more time on history today and in the next video, and then just a little bit more at the end. We're going to start off with some very early neuroanatomy. That's going to be kind of fascinating, actually. Then we're going to go to what you could view sort of as a response to neuroanatomy, although I think that the tradition is just as old and perhaps even significantly older. And then the response to mentalism, which probably is where a lot of psychology textbooks start. But this is, these early points are where philosophers made a big impact in helping guide the field of psychology. Up until this period, psychology departments were still within philosophy departments, broadly construed. And then we're going to see some problems for behaviorism. All right, let's do it. So the father of modern physiology, von Haller, starts investigating the human body and starts considering philosophical ideas about how the body might, in some sense, ground the mind or soul or self or whatever you want to call it. He has a lot of interesting ideas, some of which we pick up on, but at toward the end of his life and in following on him, there's other approaches that start actually looking at the body as revealing some features of the mind, right? So some that you might be acquainted with, physiognomy. Actually, some of you might even do this to people by accident or on purpose, where you judge them based on their appearance, right? So Johann Caspar Lavater coins physiognomy and use catalogs the various traits that people's faces could have and what he thinks it reveals about their character. Again, not a lot of really robust science, not a lot of experiments that show that this wasn't just vindicating his own prejudice, but very popular and still, I guess, to this day, something that people sometimes do. Moving forward to a discussion of phrenology, which I think might be familiar to many of you. The father of phrenology, Franz Joseph Gall, is influenced by physiognomy, but begins to think that perhaps there might be another way of explaining this, right? So it's not merely the appearance of someone's face that is evidence of their character, but there is a full story about how if the brain is the seat of the mind, then during development, the brain might be affected by circumstance, and it might affect the shape of the head altogether. So Gall has this idea from drawing connections between people's face, head shapes and traits that he recognized in them. And so he proposed that there were some innate inherited characteristics that were transmitted via parts of the brain. And depending on how big your brain was in certain regions, you would be better or worse at certain traits. You would be more or less of a scoundrel or better at memory or whatnot. And your skull would ossify, would turn into bone around the shape of your brain. So you'd be able to read the shape of the brain by touching somebody's skull. It became extremely popular. This idea had a long shelf life. And there are phrenology parlors, uh, people from all walks of life, presidents, um, lots and lots of people took part in this. So this isn't just a mere episode in history that is interesting, although I think it is an interesting episode in history. I think that it reveals a fundamental debate that was popular early on in psychology and the understanding of the mind, but also to a certain extent matters today. And that's the debate between localizers and whole brainers, right? So localizers believe that there were sections of the brain that were responsible for different things, whereas whole brainers thought that the entire brain was responsible for everything. So if you lost a portion of your brain, you would lose, let's say, that percentage of your speed, your intelligence, whatever. Nowadays, when we try to think about the brain in this particular way, it's not obvious to me that either of these views, strictly speaking, are false. There are localized aspects of certain traits where if you get certain damage, it will very much affect that particular trait. But there's all sorts of damage that you can have that will affect other parts of your mind. Think about like the internet, for example. If you destroy a cluster of computers, you might not be able to access what's on those particular computers, but the rest of the internet might be negligibly slower. If you destroyed 10% of computers on the internet, well, depending on what those 10% of computers were, it would have some effect. So it's a debate that's going to continue, localizers versus whole brainers. Keep that in mind, probably for the quiz. So what were the problems for phrenology? Okay, well, there were internal problems. Number one is that they couldn't agree on a story. How many organs are there in the brain? I don't know, dozens. Where are they? Again, people didn't know. There were scientific problems, right? When people were dissected, the expected results weren't found. The brains weren't exactly what the phrenologists said that they were. Lobotomies on early brain damage on animals did not cause the sorts of damage that phrenologists claimed that they would. And development of other theories helped move the scientific community away from this, which is a common story in science, where you have an idea and it's only really rejected when new ideas take over. Finally, phrenologists were accused socially of being materialistic and atheistic. These techniques were often used to bar people from getting jobs. They were often used against lower and middle class people. The traits that were associated with all of the good features, all of the pro-social, happy, positive, intelligent, whatever features, tended to be the ones that were associated with the upper class, the wealthy. And it had some pretty horrific consequences. This idea, developed by a scientist hundreds of years before King Leopold even existed, was used to divide entire populations in Africa. It was used in the South to decide who got to work, which slaves worked inside versus outside. It was used just to make divisions that created permanent rifts in society. one of which in the mid-1990s, there was a genocide in Rwanda. Um, so centuries later, there was a genocide, and it was between two groups that had been deemed by the early phrenologists to be distinct. And the early phrenologists deemed one group to be superior and gave them all of the good positions. They were in charge, and they subjugated the other group. The Hutus and the Tutsis were the names of these two groups. And then when the Hutus took over, they no longer wanted to be part of that structure, and so they went on a genocide against their perceived aggressors. So centuries later, this had horrifying consequences. Ideas have long legs. They have long tails. They have some anthropomorphic consequence metaphor. All right. The last thing I'll say with early psychology and early neuroanatomy is the idea of shock treatments, which became popular after World War I. There were lots of patients that came back from the war. We might now say that they had post-traumatic stress disorder. They would be called shell-shocked or with battle fatigue. They had issues, and they had a hard time adjusting. And so we invented a variety of ways of treating some of these consequences. Insulin shock therapy, convulsive therapy, deep sleep therapy. All of these were intended to create a big response in the body to try to like reboot the mind. The only one we still use is electroconvulsive therapy, invented in the early 20th century, although we don't use it as frequently or for the same purposes that they did when it was invented. It turns out electroconvulsive therapy is actually still effective in about 25% of persistent depressive cases. So, I know, it's shocking. All right. I will take a little bit of a detour as the professor's prerogative to talk about lobotomies. In this tradition, when we're thinking about the brain and the mind as having a deep relationship to each other, as we did with the phrenology and the shock treatments, there were people that thought that perhaps there were some bad parts of the brain that caused some of the ailments that we see. So in the same way that diseased tissue can sometimes cause problems, you can, like gangrene and whatnot, you can just remove parts of the brain in order to save people's minds. So Antonio Moniz witnesses a lecture of a previously aggressive chimpanzee who has become docile after it had its frontal lobe removed, makes a comment that what if we did this to people, is viewed almost as a horrific joke, but then actually develops a way to do this with a patient that was aggressive, well, had not responded to any other treatments. He removes what are called little cores of brain, just chunks of her brain in this really long procedure, and publishes the technique, winning a Nobel Prize because it had an effect that no other treatment had had at the time. Walter Freeman, who had some daddy issues, decides that he wants to bring this approach to the United States. He's not a surgeon, but he is a doctor. And he begins working with a surgeon to try to introduce lobotomies in patients that he thinks it could benefit. Over his career, he performed thousands of lobotomies across 23 states, mostly with women, many gay patients. There is a video you can click on the PowerPoint where it shows an interview with a patient who was lobotomized as a child, as a 12-year-old. He's much older in the video. It's a good video. I recommend you watch it, or look at any interviews of patients who were lobotomized who didn't realize that they were lobotomized. So he developed the technique because he thought that careful surgical lobotomies took too long. He was practicing on cadavers when he reached into his drawer and found an ice pick, hence the derogatory term ice pick lobotomies. And he slid it in between the eye orb and the nose into the brain and wiggled it around. The patient's eyes would patients would get black eyes. And he began teaching this technique to people because some of the patients, about a third of the patients, reported actually getting better, seeing improvements in their affect, or at least their family noticed improvements. Freeman claimed that he reverted people to a childlike state. You can see some images of what happened to certain brains. There's just this characteristic wiping across a brain. He taught a lot of doctors all over the country how to do this. And he would perform many operations, many trick operations, flipping the ice pick in his hand, doing 2 at a time, posing. Lots of his patients died in the process. Not Rosemary Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's sister, whose father thought that she was too rebellious of a young lady, and so he, when she was in her early 20s, he took her to see Freeman, and he gave her a lobotomy. She was never the same. Why was he able to do this? Because people wanted a solution. People thought that this was a way of fixing persistent problems with the mind. There were problems, and there were some internal problems. Only about a third of patients actually had positive results, and about a third had negative results. There were patients that had multiple lobotomies, 2 or 3 lobotomies. Many patients died. The scientific community refused to comment. But as more patients died, patients began calling for investigations, calling attention on this. And in the 1950s, a medicine was invented, which was marketed as a chemical lobotomy, that had fewer side effects to this surgical procedure, then became widely accepted. And that was actually the real cause. I mean, you'll see this again and again in these discussions. It's not internal problems, and usually it's not even scientific problems with worldviews that causes them to go down. Usually there are social or changing factors in society that make people less inclined to accept a particular procedure. Freeman stopped performing lobotomies in 1967, more than a decade after there was a chemical treatment for the procedures he thought that he was addressing. The tail end of his life, he spent trying to find patients that he had worked on to show that he had improved them in some way. Okay. discuss mentalism and behaviorism in the next video.